Well, hello and welcome to everyone joining us for this X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled GCP ICH E6 R3 Unveiled, Navigating the Evolving Roles of Sponsors and CROs. My name is Corey Stanton and I'll be your X-Talks host for this event. Today's presentation runs for approximately 60 minutes and the webinar includes an interactive Q&A session at the end. To make the most of this session, feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation and we'll try to attend to as many as possible. If you're joining us via GoToWebinar, you can use the questions chat box, which is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance, please don't hesitate to contact me by sending a message using this very same chat box. And if you're viewing this presentation from our LinkedIn Live event, you can submit your questions using the comments tab on LinkedIn. Please note that all audience members are in listen-only mode and that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming to those who registered on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Adamas Consulting, who developed the content for this presentation. Adamas Consulting is a leading global specialist consultancy company providing independent quality assurance and quality management services across GCP, GVP, GLP, CSC, and GMP. With offices across 3 continents, Adamas delivers expert compliance solutions to pharmaceutical, biotech, and healthcare organizations worldwide. For over 25 years, Adamas has conducted thousands of GXP audits in over 100 countries for more than 750 international clients, ensuring the highest regulatory and quality standards. Their team of experienced professionals supports clients in maintaining compliance, integrity, and operational excellence in clinical research and pharmaceutical development. And now let's take a moment to meet our panelists for today's presentation. One of our speakers today is Dr. Elsa Ferrao. Dr. Ferrao is a skilled pharmaceutical professional with over 8 years of experience as a regulator. She has played an instrumental role in the development of regulatory guidance and health legislation, as well as conducting inspections for the Portuguese National Authority for Medicines and Health Products across GXPs, GCP inspections on behalf of the EMA, and joint inspections with the MHRA, US FDA, and Health Canada. Currently serving as a GCP principal consultant at Adamas Consulting, she has conducted numerous audits for sponsors, CROs, vendors, and clinical investigator sites. And also joining us today is Penelope Hutton. Penelope is an accomplished quality professional with over 20 years of experience, starting as a clinical data manager in clinical pharmacology and pediatric studies. She became certified in GCP early in her career and has since led CAPA management and authored position papers on regulatory topics. Penelope has conducted over 100 audits globally and developed quality strategies for molecules in development and marketed settings. At Adamas, she focuses on advancing data analytics in quality and providing QA consultancy services. And now, without any further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our first speaker today, Dr. Elsa Ferrao. Elsa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you for the introductions. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all attending. You must be seeing at this moment the disclaimer slide. These are just here for reference. It's the usual Adamas disclaimers. Won't go into detail. I just want to highlight that the contents presented during this webinar are based on the currently approved parts of ICH E6 R3, meaning the principles and Annex 1. So we will not be covering Annex 2 at this point. And even if it's just principles and Annex 1, be mindful this is a 1-hour webinar, so we will only be likely touching these parts as well. I would like to proceed with a quick quiz for you. So we want to understand how you're facing this new ICH GCP revision. So Corey, if you want to launch the quiz, please.
Yes, excellent. Thank you, Elsa. We do have an interactive poll question for audience members to respond to in real time as we kick off our webinar here today. Appearing on your screen now, you can vote on this question by clicking on any of the answers and hitting the submit button. And the question we have for you is, with regards to the update to ICH E6, which team are you on? And your options here are R3 doesn't bring anything new, that's option A. Option B, R3 is a complete game changer. Or option C, R3 brings some changes that will require some focus. So again, we're looking to just get a sense of, before we kick off into this presentation here today, with regards to this update on ICH E6, which team do you fall on? Are you A, R3 doesn't bring anything new, B, R3 is a complete game changer, or C, R3 brings some changes that will require some focus? And again, very simple to vote on our poll here. You can click on any of the options and click the submit button. I do thank our audience members who have already voted. I'll leave the poll open for about 10-15 more seconds. So if you haven't had a chance to lock in your vote yet, make sure you do so now. And then we'll take a brief peek at those results before I hand things back over to Elsa to kick off the presentation. Excellent. Thank you everyone for voting. I'm going to leave the poll open for another 10 seconds. So if you haven't had a chance to lock in your vote, make sure you do so now. Click on any of the options and hit the submit button. Thank you everyone for those last minute votes. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now, and let's take a quick look at those results. So we have kind of an overwhelming majority here. 92% have gone with the middle ground, option C, of R3 bringing some changes that will require some focus. Then we have 6%, R3 being a complete game changer, and only 3% of our audience suggesting that it doesn't bring anything new. And with that, Elsa, I'll hand things back over to you.
Thank you, Corey. These are very interesting results, and hopefully by the end of the webinar, there's going to be some positive and really useful insights for everyone, the majority who has responded, but also for the other two options that were responded. So I want to proceed now with the contents of the webinar. We'll be likely touching the evolving clinical trial ecosystem just to likely set the scene, and then we'll focus on key concepts that we think are the core of this new revision. So we'll be covering in a little bit more detail the quality by design, fitness for purpose concepts, the risk-based and proportionate approaches, the focus on oversight, which is something that is running now throughout GCP, and the new section, data governance. In the end, we'll also be discussing what you can do to ensure that you remain GCP compliant, and we'll reserve some time for Q&A in the end, as Corey has already mentioned. So we'll be now looking into the evolving clinical trial ecosystem. We live in a fast-pacing world, and clinical trials are not exception. One of the most outstanding reasons for the changes in the clinical trial landscape is undeniably the evolution of technology and the possibilities it brings. We're now able to collect more data more quickly, even real time actually, and remotely, so in person is not even required anymore. We're also able to relate different sets of data. We're able to share it with different people with different parts. And based on correlations that we make, we can also predict some outputs. So in terms of clinical development, for instance, these are frequently used to support surrogate endpoints, but also we can make trend analysis and understand what's the trend about our performance indicators, our quality indicators. So there's a world of possibilities currently that actually complicated protocols, right? We have an increased complexity with combined phases, adaptive designs, and it complicated as well data management activities with all the variability of sources of data and technologies used nowadays. We have data from central labs, from specialty labs, data from wearables, study-specific apps, all in addition to our traditional CRF application. So all this evolving scenario brought some quick progress in medicine's development and sped up the availability of new treatments to patients, which is great. But with more data, more variables, and more complex trial designs, there's definitely a need to focus on what's really more relevant for trials participants, for their safety and well-being, but also more relevant for the trial data itself. So what I'm saying is, in essence, we now need to focus on what's critical to the quality of the clinical trial. So there's definitely a need to update ICH GCP after basically 9 years, and the technological advances was one of the most important reasons. But we should not forget there's a whole family of guidelines that should be read in conjunction, so together with ICH GCP, and that all together they represent a regulatory framework that supports thoughtfulness in design and conduct of a trial. So they all support the quality by design and fitness for purpose and risk proportionality that we're about to discuss here. Okay, this is just some examples of the most ICHE family guidelines to consider in a clinical trial. There are much more to consider. There are multidisciplinary guidelines as well, depending on the type of trial. So I'll just leave it here as an example of the full regulatory framework that supports a clinical trial nowadays. So let's take a closer look at these concepts, quality by design and fitness for purpose. Here's an EMA definition for quality by design. This is taken from the EMA website, a very high level definition that can be applied in the full pharmaceutical development life cycle. So in fact, the concept has its inception in the pharmaceutical development guidelines, in particular ICH Q8, where you can find a very interesting quote that says, quality cannot be tested into products. Quality should be built in by design. This was driven by the fact that there should be some in-process control of the product development, some design space with flexibility in product specifications, so you can keep developing your product without changing specifications, and it could be corrected in due course instead of waiting for a final product to test and fail, with all the implications in time and cost. So the same principle could and was in fact adopted for clinical trials. In 2021, the quality by design concept is formally introduced in the clinical trials arena by ICH E8R1, with the purpose of ensuring that all efforts in clinical development could be planned with quality in mind. This will minimize time and cost for everyone, and most importantly, efforts from sites and participants. So the ICH E8R1 definition applies to the clinical development programs, but also to individual trials in itself. And in there, you will also find that this is an approach established with the purpose to identify and review critical to quality factors from design and planning the study through its conduct, analysis, and reporting. So in the end, the focus is on prospective planning and design. And in ICH E8, you will also find that retrospective quality controls and quality assurance activities are currently not enough. They're not sufficient to ensure the quality of a clinical trial. So fast forward to 2025, we have in principle 6.2 dimension to factors critical to the quality of the trial should be identified prospectively. And if you have correctly implemented E8R1 since 2022, this doesn't come as a surprise, and you are already identifying and reviewing ongoing the critical to quality factors of your studies and the risks and the measures to minimize the risks. Another concept that was not so evident in E8R1, but it's now highlighted throughout this R3, is fitness for purpose. And this is mentioned in 6.1. So together, quality by design and fitness for purpose, they mean that the quality of a clinical trial needs to be prospectively planned, designed with a study, and they result from having activities that are meaningful for the purpose of the study. So by extension, all methods, systems, tools, procedures, they should be adequate to the purpose that they will fulfill in the trial. So this is a slide just to summarize what we've been saying. And if you implement quality by design and fitness for purpose, you will ensure an optimal trial design that by the time it reaches operations, it's a feasible and a fine-tuned study. So if you implement quality by design and fitness for purpose, you will also achieve other objectives that are included in R3, like operational feasibility and unnecessary complexity and burden. So all these concepts, they are supported on another concept that we'll see in a second, which is risk proportionality. I've just highlighted here in the right-hand side some aspects that you should consider during trial design then to ensure operational feasibility. We'll not go into detail. They're here just for reference. What I would like to move forward with is with the risk proportionality, so risk-based and proportionate approaches. So risk management was already defined in R2, and the section 5.0 was an addendum. However, there were no principles in section 2, so by the time the addendum was created, there were no updates in the principles section in the end of 2016. But currently in this revision, we have now formally a GCP principle related to risk proportionality, and this is principle 7. And in 7.1, it's explained that you should have a risk-based approach, and that should be proportionate to the risks inherent to the trial and the importance of the information collected. I would like to take a little more time in 7.2 because it goes even into more detail. It's basically saying that risks are inherently higher in trials that involve new products, new procedures, anything that comes outside the regular standard of care. So basically we should be focusing on what risks exist beyond that standard of care. So let's see, for example, you have a study that includes a genomic study or somehow a genomic criteria, and that usually involves collection of PBMC samples, which are highly sensitive biological samples. Are those critical for your trial? This is the first thinking that you should consider. How critical are those samples for my trial? Are they related to an exploratory endpoint, or are they determining participant eligibility somehow? And then how are your sites going to be selected depending on their experience collecting, processing, shipping these types of samples? Will that be covered in your site training material? Will that be adequately monitored at site? So how's your monitoring plan, and how will your reports demonstrate that? On the other hand, you must have a specialty lab involved in this for sure. So how have you qualified that lab? Are you aware of the bioanalytical methods and its validation process, for instance? And downstream, how are the results being reported back, either to the site or to the sponsor? Are there any risks in transmitting that information? Are there any blinding maintenance that needs to be considered? So all these aspects need to be put into perspective in relation to if it's a standard of care, if it's a regular procedure, and what's their criticality for your trial. And the same rationale actually applies to product administration, safety risks, and other aspects. And it's also highlighted in 7.2 that the risks, there's some consideration with relation to marketed products. And basically it's saying that the risks may be lower if the product is an approved product, but there's the caveat that the context needs to be considered. And we've seen that in some trials where marketed products are used as IMPs, depending on the context of the trial, that they actually may have the same level of risks, or for instance, even higher than a new product. So all this needs to be taken into consideration, and they align with the principle that you need to have risk proportionality in mind. Now, where should we see this mindset? This mindset, the straight answer is from start to end, right? So from the trial design, you should be identifying your critical to quality factors and the risks, and implementing proportional control measures while ensuring operational feasibility. So for example, you have a confirmatory trial where you've included 10 exploratory endpoints. Is that really needed? What else is to explore at this point? How are those related to the hypothesis you are about to confirm, which is the main purpose of that trial at that moment? And what added burden does it bring to participants and sites? So keep in mind during trial design also these aspects. Sponsor oversight is a section as well in R3, and Penny will expand on this topic. I don't want to take much time on this. These are just a list of items where we should also see the risk proportionality mindset. In the quality management, it's highlighted the need to monitor your risk control measures in a proportionate manner. And I want to take some time here on the quality tolerance limits, which are one of the tools that you may use to control your risk measures. R3 leaves it to be implemented where relevant. So you should also use a proportionate approach to Q2Ls. It may not be useful or even feasible to have thresholds to define for some risk control measures. So this usually requires a metric that it's both quantifiable and to some level predictable. So let's say, for instance, protocol deviations. In theory, none are expected. So you know your theoretical threshold. In practice, we know this is not the case, but anyway, it's an easily measurable and definitely relevant for both participants and data. So Q2Ls are easily applicable and actually highly recommended. You can also add some granularity depending on the type of protocol deviation. And let's not forget that you have now, according to R3, to formally define which deviations you are considering as important deviations. So Q2Ls are a metric, are a tool that you can use on a metric such as protocol deviations, and that could be a relevant way to ensure that you trigger the actions necessary to mitigate the risks associated with protocol deviations. Now, another example, for instance, adverse events or SAEs can be a little more tricky to decide if it's useful or not to implement a Q2L. I mean, is there really an expected value for SAEs? Can you anticipate a number? How can you set a threshold for triggering any actions? And on the other hand, safety is being monitored on other grounds, for example, by a safety committee at the SMB and all additional medical monitoring activities. So the importance of setting a Q2L to a more tight control of SAEs is really dependent on the type of study, the prior known safety information, and all the other safety monitoring approaches that you are using in a trial. So in summary, be mindful of Q2Ls, how you implement it, and its relevance. QA and QC, this is another section that Penny will expand. I'll not take much time here. So be mindful of audits, non-compliance management, monitoring, safety assessment, and IMP. All of this should be conducted with risk proportionality in mind. I'm just going to take some time here on safety assessment because I think that's relevant. 313.1 says that sponsors should aggregate as appropriate the safety information and report it to investigators in a manner that reflect the urgency of action required and the evolving knowledge of the safety profile, something like that. So it's basically asking the sponsors to reflect on the ways the information is provided to the investigators. And again, that should be fit for purpose. And on data handling, again, this is something where you should be implementing your risk proportionality. And again, I'll leave that to Penny to expand. I just want to highlight here that on the first topic, QC of your data at relevant stages and at the ones of higher criticality, I want to pinpoint that your external data are also study data, and they need to be included in your plans to QC and data review. And in the end, another area where you should be seeing risk proportionality is, of course, essential records. And though we know from R3 that you don't need to retain your risk assessment with regards to essential records, be mindful that the result of that will be visible because it will result on your TMF index, on your table of contents, on your list of expected documents, and ultimately it will be reflected in the availability or not of those records. So it's something that just because it says that you don't need to retain your risk assessment, be mindful that the result of it will be visible and will be scrutinized. So risk proportionality from trial design to trial records. Now, just a call here that risk proportionality is all about doing the right decisions that are proportionate to the risks. And to do that, you need to be supported on knowledge. And knowledge results from the information that data provides us. And data analytics is a concept that is introduced in R3 in the QA and QC section. It's mostly in relation to monitoring. It's also mentioned in the subsection of centralized monitoring activities, because that's what basically is, it's data analytics activities. So the expectation is that trial data are being looked at, and this generates information that it's relevant for deciding where to look further and deeper, and where to allocate efforts and resources in a risk proportionate manner. But this is actually an expandable concept. So the same principle can be applied to other areas of QA and QC. And recently, the amount of data generated is valuable, for example, to make risk assessments of service providers, computerized systems, investigator sites, and that in turn can be applied to QA decisions, such as which sites or which internal departments to audit and when, and what areas to focus during those audits. So in conclusion, data analytics is not restricted to monitoring activities and could even be considered the backbone of your risk proportionate quality system, since it's the process by which your data generates the knowledge to support your risk proportional decisions. And at this point, I just want to highlight some of what could be considered red flags and indicators that you're not fully implementing a quality by design approach, fitness for purpose, and risk proportionality. And please note these are just examples, so each circumstance may be different. Context needs to be taken into consideration. But for instance, on number one, not having identified critical to quality factors and their risks prior to study start, and or not continuing to review it throughout the study. So this is definitely a red flag. Your risk management process should not be crafted in stone, and risk identification and management is not a one and only activity at study start. So you should assess how you're using your risk logs, your risk assessment and categorization tools. Are they being reviewed periodically? Are you communicating the risks to all relevant parties? Are you updating accordingly your measures to control those risks? This is what you should be reviewing at this point. Number two, you need to issue protocol clarification letters or do extra investigative meetings or trainings. So that really what communicates is that you're probably not implementing quality by design and fitness for purpose if you require extensive clarifications of your protocols. And the same goes for number three. If you need to amend several times in a short time your protocol, perhaps you're not thinking prospectively enough at trial design, or perhaps you're not involving all the required stakeholders from the start. So something also to be mindful. And number four, high turnover of service providers during study conduct. So this really speaks to your qualification process. Is your service provider qualification process fit for purpose? What are you missing because you're in need of changing so many times your providers? And on number five, unnecessary data collected in DDC. And there's two aspects in relation to this example. Could your protocol be collecting unnecessary data? Do you really need to collect those thousands of data points? Perhaps you need to go back and see if your protocol is actually fit for purpose and with quality by design in mind. And a second aspect would be, is your EDC collecting data that is not required per protocol? Because you need to have a fit for purpose EDC, and that means that it should be aligned with the protocol and not the other way around, for instance. And on number six, you have a high number of protocol deviations across all sites. Well, this speaks for itself. You should really track down the root cause of those deviations, and if it can be related to a specific service provider, a specific system, or a specific aspect of the trial. So you need to define that and see what's the conclusion you can take from there. And at this point, I would like to hand over to Penny for her to follow up on the focus on oversight. Penny.
Thank you, Elsa. So I'd like to focus on R3 with regards to oversight. And I do believe that R3 brings back the focus to oversight. Oversight is one of the pillars that runs throughout GCP and is a shared responsibility. Appropriate oversight should provide assurance that the data reported and the results are credible, as well as protecting the rights, safety and well-being of trial participants. As Elsa highlighted earlier, operational feasibility is key, and I'll talk about that more later. So I should highlight in R2, oversight only occurred 3 times, and delegate or delegation occurred 4 times. And these were predominantly in the investigator responsibilities section. So with R3, a question would be, how many times did oversight or delegation occur? Oversight now occurs 23 times throughout the document, with delegate again 23 times, or delegation. It appears in the standard. We now have GCP defined, and within that definition of GCP is oversight. So it's quite important. You can see that it is really embedded into the revision. We also have Principle 10.3, which refers to oversight and actually talks about the roles and responsibility of sharing oversight between investigator and sponsor. It's in the first paragraph of GCP in the introduction. It's in the investigator section throughout, referring to oversight activities. And unsurprisingly, throughout the sponsor section. It's in the essential records and also Appendix C, C1. So we'd look at the principle first, Principle 10, and the roles and responsibilities in clinical trials should be clear and documented appropriately. This really embeds the concept of operational feasibility that Elsa spoke to earlier, and that responsibility is a key shared responsibility between the sponsor and the investigator. It should be noted that 10.1 still allows or permits the sponsor to delegate activities, as was previously stated in R2, Section 5, but it's no longer a standalone bullet point. It's a sub-point within sponsor oversight. And that is quite key, that the revision to R3 is highlighting that the sponsor retains that oversight, where we may have seen in R2 or under R2 and the application that sponsors using various models did delegate quite a lot of their activities and perhaps had a lighter touch on oversight than the regulators perhaps would have wanted. The other point to notice is there's no longer a standalone definition of CROs. We now have this wider term of service providers, which incorporates CROs in that definition. And this is quite a shift, perhaps, in mindset. And from the regulators, they have stated that this wider term is to incorporate all parties involved with clinical trials. So this also includes your IT vendors who perhaps previously didn't think of themselves as a CRO or thought of themselves in that bracket and were not bound in the same way as CROs. The expectation is through the oversight process in supporting documentation. As auditors or inspectors, we will see the application of the principles of quality by design and proportionate risk-based approach, and that this paradigm shift that is expected through R3 revision will actually occur. So I'd just like to take some time to look at the sponsor oversight. So there is a renewed focus on sponsor oversight. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see some references to the sponsor section which talk to sponsor oversight. And these are just the ones that I wanted to highlight, but please be aware it's not an exhausted list. But the application of oversight should be seen throughout the clinical trial process. So as Elsa has highlighted in the initial design phase, you're looking for that proportionate risk-based approach to be embedded, and built upon that would be operational feasibility. And that then extends down to your service provider selection and oversight. So when we look at service providers, I think this is quite a critical time to revisit your organization's process for oversight and selection of service providers. Does your organization process encompass now all of your service providers? Does it cross-reference the vendor selection process for all the third-party vendors, starting with the CRO, but also going on to the other vendors that Elsa has mentioned previously, any niche laboratories, IT vendors that include your data management aspects. So not just your ECRF, but any additional lab transfers or any transfers of additional information or data into the study database. Does it also incorporate the investigator and site selection? Do you need to revisit the whole process to make sure that you have that proportionate risk-based approach inbuilt from an end-to-end oversight? The other consideration is the risk-based methodology to be followed. Is that consistent and is that understood between all vendors? So does the sponsor share their risk-based methodology with their service providers to ensure that they are working to the same principles? And does the agreement with service providers accurately reflect the proportionate risk-based delegation of tasks and the oversights that we use to monitor? So that would be the QTLs that Elsa spoke to earlier. So again, on this slide, I've highlighted on the left-hand side specific sections of E6 R3, which refer again to sponsor oversight. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's just some to highlight and for you to think about. So we need to be able to demonstrate sponsor oversight, and we have various tools at our disposal to do that. So at an organisation level, you'll have agreements and governance documents potentially in place, or those could be sat at a programme level. There's also the protocol, which under the new definition of agreements within R3 is an agreement or a contract, using the old terminology. So as well as your investigators who will have signed the protocol signature page, all of your third party or service providers working on the study and working towards that protocol, that is also an agreement in addition to any other documents or contracts that have been signed. And then we have the feasibility or study oversight plan. So the terminology may be different within your organisation, but this is just to highlight the risk-based approach and proportionate approach, and the quality by design should be embedded in those documents. And then we have quality activities. So again, this is a key point where we could highlight to really readdress and relook at our audit activities. Can we leverage other tools rather than just the traditional audit? And as Elsa has mentioned, one example would be through data analytics, which could be used in multiple scenarios. So not just them addressing or selecting sites or service providers for audit, but perhaps using data analytics as a tool to conduct an audit in, as Elsa said, with the changing ecosystem, we actually have access to real-time data very, very quickly. So there's a lot to be thinking about with regards to R3 and how this could implement a paradigm shift. So we talked briefly about the oversight documents that be in place, but then you also need to demonstrate to a regulator or an auditor that you have followed your oversight process. And you do that via your meeting minutes, risk logs, issue logs, reports, and escalation plans. So they need to be, when reviewed in combination, they will be the documents that provide evidence of that risk-based proportionate approach. So they do need to be clear, and you're able to evidence sponsor oversight from those documents. If we move on to the investigator oversight, this is perhaps the biggest change within R3. We see that acknowledgement, as Elsa mentioned, that clinical trials have become more complex And by this, the burden on the investigator and site has increased, and the ability to comply with E6R2 was cumbersome, but also was not potentially needed in the detail or level of documentation to ensure patient safety and data reliability. In R3, we see that shift to an appropriate delegation and oversight. And this is where operational feasibility activities become very important. Has the sponsor discussed the risk-based approach with the investigator? Does the sponsor have an understanding of the operational aspects at the site? Who will be doing what? And is this aligned with the risk-based proportionate approach? The critical data points supporting endpoints, has this been discussed and agreed? Who will be performing the task and what level of knowledge of the clinical trial do they need, and what escalation process is in place if they are not defined to be required, fully trained on that clinical trial. Within the feasibility discussion, you need to review the systems being used by the investigator, but I'll talk more about that in the data governance section. The service providers proposed to be used by the sponsor must have sufficient documentation provided to the investigator for them to make an educated and agree with that selection, because it still remains the investigator has to have that oversight. But what I would like to share is just one slide with inspection findings. Now, this is taken from the GCP Inspectors Working Group from 2023. And I just want to focus on two subcategories from the main general category. And that is with regards to contracts and agreements and organisation and personnel. So for both of those subcategories, there were 23 total inspection findings. And these centred around lack of or unclear documentation of duties and tasks delegated service providers by the sponsor, a lack of contracts and agreements between the investigator and facilities involved in the trial. So with the new terminology of agreements, wrapping in all contracts, master service agreements, scope of work, the hope is R3 will clarify that all documentation between the sponsor and the investigator and service providers need to be clear and built on that risk-based proportionate principles. And then with regards to the organisation and personnel, the inspection findings were related to deficiencies in the delegation of trial-related tasks. So they saw persons not delegated to perform trial-related tasks who were involved in the trial. So you could say, for example, these could be clinical nurses in their usual clinical environment performing a blood draw or providing an infusion, which is their routine activity. But because they were doing it within the clinical trial and under R2, they should have been delegated depending on the study. Another aspect or another inspection finding was delegation of tasks documented retrospectively and an incomplete list of personnel involved in the trial. So we could say, following a well-documented risk-based approach, will a reduction in the number of these types of inspection findings be seen if R3 is implemented in that risk-based proportionate response? So moving on to data governance. So this is a completely new section within R3. It defines a framework which was lacking in E6R2 and embeds proportional risk management principles into data governance. And it's a holistic approach to management document with all sponsor functions and investigators and regulators where needed. So it's a framework that facilitates the documentation of all critical aspects for the clinical trial. So it starts at the design phase in parallel with the concepts of quality by design and definition of critical data factors. Again, this is a shared responsibility between all parties. In some respects, it's no change to the principle of can I recreate the trial and decisions made? But this new section provides a framework to the data governance. It embeds data governance process at the start of the study, but as Elsa highlighted earlier, it should not be read in isolation. So firstly, section 4 for data governance should be read with the other sections within E6, but also with E8, the general considerations for the clinical trials, and E9, statistical principles for clinical trials, but also with the other ICH products that may be relevant to your particular study design. So data governance is not covering everything. It relies on the sponsor and investigator defining what are the essential records, what is critical for your study to recreate the study and the key decisions made in that study. To get clarity on the requirements of the data governance, I find it easy to focus on Principle 9 to put the selection into perspective. So if you particularly look at sections 9.1, the quality amount of information generated in the trial should be fit for purpose and sufficient. So as Elsa said, it doesn't mean you have to collect absolutely everything, but you do have to be able to clearly see what has been collected and then any decisions that have been made on that data and how it has progressed the study. And then the other point which I wanted to highlight on this slide is 9.3, but also 9.2 wraps nicely into this. With regards to the systems and processes and computerized systems, they should all be fit for purpose. But again, you need to have that proportionate risk-based approach, and it should be for the most important, based on the importance of the acquired data. So that doesn't mean then you have to do 100% validation and following that computer systemized approach across all the systems being used for your clinical trial, but you do need to make sure that you have made that review and decisions following your risk-based methodology. So if we look at data governance from the sponsor's perspective, so again, just highlighted are some points from section 4. In the trial design and protocol initiation stage, you want to see that risk management plan and communication plan set up and managed as a dynamic process throughout the study. The key phrase to think of is the proportionate risk-based operational approach. And it could be, as I said earlier, suggest revisiting your organization's feasibility process for both site and service provider selection. So those on the screen are the key documents that I mentioned earlier, which is how you would demonstrate data governance and would be part of your oversight documentation. So as I said earlier, you can see that E6 various sections relate to each other. The other document not shown on the slide is the TMF plan. And that is quite a key document as it defines the location of all the essential documents. So you do need to ensure that you revisit that and make sure it's accurate when you are looking at your risk-based approach. And from an investigator perspective, the same principles apply. Data governance will potentially raise more questions for the investigator and the sponsor to implement a risk-based approach. Remember, you'll also need to ensure that the investigator is included all computerized systems used in this assessment. But as Elsa said, we're moving to a more complex and generally computer-based environment. However, paper-based data governance is still a valid method. So just think you need to have that flexibility within your oversight documents. Investigators often use hospital systems for clinical trials, and questions do need to be addressed with this risk-based approach. That has the investigator completed an assessment to ensure these fully meet the requirements of clinical trials and provide to the sponsor? Has the sponsor ensured all relevant systems been noted and assessed? Again, it's a shared responsibility, and the assessment will need to be made depending on the systems and the information that is going to be collected. This is an area that hasn't potentially had the same focus under R2 and may be an area of focus for the regulators. Highly recommend a good read of Annex C1 for the essential records and review in line with your organisation's expectation and reflecting the TMF. So to summarise the information that Elsa and I have shared, quality by design, fitness for purpose and proportionate risk-based approaches is a mindset from trial design to trial reporting and record keeping. Flexibility is data-driven, robust process to support that decision-making process, with oversight being one of the pillars that runs throughout GCP. And finally, data governance is a framework central to trial design, plan, conduct, analysis, and reporting. So I'll hand back to Elsa.
Thank you, Penny. So at this point, we would like to discuss with you how to maintain GCP compliance. And before we go into any detail, I would like to launch a challenge to you for you to tell us what's the most challenging with regards to R3 implementation. So Corey, if you could, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Elsa. We do have another interactive poll question for our audience members to respond to in real time. Unlike our previous poll question, you may select more than one answer from the following options for this question. This time around, we're asking about what aspect of the ICH E6R3 is the most challenging for you. And your options here are oversight changes, risk-based quality management, service provider management and oversight, or none of the above. None presenting challenges. And again, unlike our previous first poll question, this time around you can select any of the options that do apply to you in the sense of which aspect of ICH E6R3 you find to be most challenging. Thank you to our audience members who have already voted. We'll leave the poll open a little while longer to allow us to get a majority result, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at how the percentages came in. Once more, just a reminder for this poll question, you can click on any of the options and hit the submit button, and you can click multiple options for this one and to get a sense of which aspects of ICH E6R3 have been most challenging for you. And I'll go through those options one more time before we wrap up the poll here. Option A, oversight changes. B, risk-based quality management. C, service provider management and oversight. Or D, none of the above. Excellent. Thank you so much to our audience members who have voted. I'll leave the poll open for about 5 more seconds. So if you haven't had a chance to get any of your votes in there, make sure you do so now and lock it in, and we'll take a look at those results. Thank you, audience, for voting. Let's take a look. Obviously, we won't add up to 100% this time around because we do have multiple options available, but our majority came in at risk-based quality management. So 60% of our audience had voted for that one. Then almost half of our audience, 49%, voted for service provider management and oversight. We had 33% come in for oversight changes and just 5% of our audience selecting none of the above. And with that, I'll hand things back to Elsa.
Thank you, Corey. We do have kind of a roadmap for you to ensure that you remain compliant. And if you do implement the steps, probably will it will help you in handling those challenges that you have identified here in our pool. So first step would be, of course, get to know the requirements to some level of training that would require, and based on knowing the new requirements, you'll be able to do a second step, which is the gap analysis. So you will analyze the new requirements and compare it to your current processes, your current SOPs, your current systems, and see and identify what is missing, what can be improved. And on the third step, you will need to probably update your processes or even create new ones. So Cross-functional meetings and reviews may probably be required at this point. So make sure you are involving all the relevant stakeholders. And remember that data analytics, it's a relevant part of the risk proportionate system. So ensure you incorporate during your review in the new or revised processes, ensure that you incorporate the analytics you need to support your decisions. And on a second step, you will need to train your wider team, and also be mindful that you should have, again, a risk proportionate approach to training, okay? Perhaps not all people may need a full training in the guideline, so be mindful of that and ensure that your training is tailored and made in connection to the actual tasks that the staff performs. Okay, and on a fourth step would, of course, be challenging those changes. Check if your new or revised processes meet the new requirements, if they meet the expectations. To do that, you can conduct audits, internal QCs, mock inspections against these new requirements. So these are all tools that you can use to challenge your changes. An important part of this step is have an independent look. So usually a person external to the company can be useful to provide this outsider look into the new processes, or someone who had not been actively involved in actually reviewing and creating these new processes. This last slide is just to give you a sense of what's the expectation around the regulators and in particular inspectors. So there's going to be undoubtedly a new focus in inspections towards the oversight systems that you have, the data management processes, to some extension also statistics, in addition to what was already a focus. The clinical site compliance is always a focus. The informed consent process, of course, as always, it is a focus. The e-systems has been a focus for a while now, since some guidelines were issued towards the systems, and the service providers as well, now with an added focus on the oversight by extension. So I'll leave you with this last slide. There's a presentation here on what Adamus does, and that could be of help during this implementation of R3 if you want to know. And at this point, I'll just hand over back to Corey for the Q&A session. And thank you so much for attending.
Yes, excellent. Thank you very much, Elsa, and thank you, Penny, for that really insightful presentation. We are now ready to begin the Q&A portion of the event. Just being mindful of time, we'll probably only have a chance to get through a couple questions here, but to our audience members, please continue to send in your questions and comments, and we'll have a chance to follow up with you after the webinar. There's also contact information currently up there on screen, so you'll have a chance to reach out to the team at Adamus if we don't have a chance to get to your question. Just a reminder, if you are attending via GoToWebinar, you can use the questions chat box to send in your submissions, and for those of you watching on LinkedIn live events, feel free to post your questions using the comments tab that's there on LinkedIn. We have already received quite a few questions from the audience, and as I mentioned, I think we'll only be able to get through a couple, but please feel free to continue to send your questions because we will have a chance to follow up with you after the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off with this first question here, and Elsa, I'll direct this one your way. This audience member was asking if you could provide any examples of documentation created to demonstrate review and mitigation of QTC factors.
So examples of documentation to demonstrate review and mitigation of the critical to quality factors. Okay, that's a very good question. I would say that the identification of the critical to quality factors is a key process at the start. So you should have some level of documentation with regards to that, and that can be in form of a tracker, a log, which in turn will be a living document throughout the study. So further to that, and in order to evidence that you are reviewing it and mitigating it, I would say that you would have to also identify in this log or in this tracker the risks to those critical to quality factors. And going from there, you will need to elaborate all your study plans, your monitoring plans, the data review plans, data management plans, the qualification documentation from the service providers you would be using. These are all documents that will serve to demonstrate that you are reviewing and addressing the risks to your critical to quality factors. In terms of records, you will have your monitoring reports, the data review records, meeting minutes, for instance, with service providers as part of the oversight process. So all those will contribute to demonstrate that you have a process in place to identify your critical to quality factors, the risks to it, and that you are mitigating those risks depending on which risks there are, of course. Some companies do implement risk management plans. That's also something that you can do to do a more holistic approach to the risks. That's also something that I'll leave to consideration. But overall, all records from the trial will be demonstrating this approach. And I hope that's clarified. Thank you.
Fantastic, excellent. Thank you, Elsa. Great thorough answer there, and hopefully that helps our audience member who asked that question. I think we have time now just for one more question, but again, I've seen some more questions come in during our Q&A session here from the audience. Thank you for your participation. Please continue to feel free to send in questions as we're going through this final one here, and the team will have a chance to follow up with you after the webinar. We'll pass everything over to the team at Adamus Consulting. So this last question here, I think best suited for Penny to take this one. Penny, this audience member was asking about during one of your slides on sponsor oversight, you had that sort of stepwise ladder being displayed, and one of the options there was quality by design in the study oversight plans. And the audience member was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what is meant by quality by design in the study oversight.
Thanks, Corey. So really, I'm going to take this a step backwards from the documents. But what I would advise here is in the excuse me, in the design phase of the study, it's quite key that you have all of the sponsor functions involved in that design process. So by that, not just your clinical science and operations, but also to excuse me, to wrap in data management and statistical functions. And the reason I say that is that they're the key functions that are able to give insights into how data will actually look when it's being collected. So that's embedding that quality by design and fit for purpose activities for all sponsor functions right at the start. And that's then when you can see it reflected in the oversight documents. So, you know, we're all aware of monitoring plans and how they have a risk-based approach with them with regards to monitoring. So again, it all depends on the trial that is being looked at. So it is that it depends scenario, but in the documentation, you need to see that the activities being performed, for example, by the monitoring team and by the data management reflects that risk-based approach that's based on the quality BI design principles. So what are they doing with their checks, their activities, their management? Is it reflected in those documents? And I'm just going to hand over to Elsa to see if there's anything she would like to add on that point.
Thank you, Penny. I do think you've covered all the principle in itself. It's not just something that it's down to the document. It should be really embedded into the full process, and the oversight plans in the end will just reflect the full process.
Excellent. Well, thank you both, Penny and Elsa, for your insight on that. Unfortunately, just based on our timing here, I think that is going to be the end of our Q&A session. But again, I did see some more questions come in from our audience. We really appreciate your participation. If we couldn't attend to your questions, if you have any further questions, or if you're someone who's watching the archive recorded version of this webinar, you can absolutely get in touch with the team at Adamus Consulting using the contact info up on screen. We've got both Elsa and Penny's email addresses. as well as their LinkedIn profile. So please feel free to reach out, but rest assured that we'll also be sending your questions through to the team and they'll have a chance to follow up after the webinar. If you are attending via GoToWebinar, please don't forget to download the supporting document available that I pointed out under the handout section. And I've added a link in the chat box where you'll be able to view the recording of this event. You can of course share this link with your colleagues so that they may register to view it as well. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks, and after we wrap things up here, a survey window will appear on your screen. Your participation in this survey is always appreciated as it helps us to improve our webinars. A quick note for those of you watching on LinkedIn Live, we encourage you to create an account on xtalks.com and register for this event, which will not only give you access to today's recording, but to our entire library of content. Now, before we sign off, I'd just like to take a moment to thank our speakers once more for their excellent presentation. Thank you, Elsa. Thank you, Penelope. We hope our audience found this insightful and informative, and we wish you all a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.